Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the great. We try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time we met Emperor Wu, the 7th emperor of the Han, the second dynasty to rule in integrated China. While the Han were definitely more humane than their Qin predecessors, they still ruled with strength and vigor, and often had serious challenges that required, at least as they saw it, aggressive responses. Still in the early phases of his reign, Wu had to deal with one such challenge that had been plaguing his predecessors all the way back to the establishment of Han rule. This challenge that Wu inherited was quite dire. Their relationship with the horse-born nomadic warriors to the north, the Xiongnu, the ancestors of the dreaded Huns, who, led by their fearsome chieftain Attila, would one day cause so much terror in the hearts of the Roman people. This group of tribes had been a thorn in the side of the Han since the outset of their dynasty. Liu Bang himself had led campaigns against these fierce warriors, but they were more or less unconquerable. Liu Bang marched against the Xiongnu with an army of 300,000. When it was utterly crushed in battle, he shifted to a policy of placation. Wu's predecessors had declined to resolve the issue permanently, opting instead for a combination of bribes and brides. Bribes of wine, silk, and rice purchased peace by paying off the Xiongnu, and brides to form marital alliances aimed at tying families together and creating more common cause between the adversaries. It was fear of attacks from these fierce people that compelled Qin Shi Huang, never one himself to shy away from a conflict, to order the building of the Great Wall of China. The collapse of the Qin weakened the borders. The stronger state of the Han and their gradual territorial expansion was seen by the Xiongnu tribes as a threat, and as a result, they had organized into a grand coalition. Any tribe of Xiongnu was scary enough. United as a confederacy, they were terrifying. Wu understood that his army was no match for the stepped warriors to his north. In order to fund the necessary reforms and expansion to update his capabilities, Wu needed to increase his revenues. The first thing he did was dramatically increases the taxes on the nobility. This got the cash flowing into his coffers. It also had the added benefit of taking resources away from the group that tended to cause problems for the emperors. Wu then nationalized two of China's most profitable industries, salt and iron. He likewise made private production of either commodity illegal, thus creating a state monopoly on industry that would produce great revenues. He also reorganized the state currency and banned any private minting of coins. As with salt and iron, the state took control of an important means of economic productivity. He even established fixed prices for grain, in part to ensure that he could buy foodstuffs at scale. This allowed Wu to fund and feed his military while creating all the benefits that come with such standardization. With his reforms in place and his army stronger than ever, beginning in 133 BCE, Wu decided to tackle the thorny issue of the Xiongnu, officially ending the tribute payments and ordering his generals to raid their territory and fight the nomadic warriors. It was a difficult task. The Xiongnu were highly mobile, horse-born warriors. They were difficult to corner and hard to beat in any confrontation. Complicating matters was that the traditional Chinese approach to warfare was centered around chariots, which might be terrifying to opposing infantry, but were downright cumbersome against horse-born nomads. Wu adapted by changing the tactics of his armies, dispensing with the chariots and switching to shock cavalry forces. The campaigns against the Xiongnu were grinding and difficult, but by 119 BCE, Wu's armies had driven the Xiongnu off the border and across the Gobi Desert. His victories came at a great loss on all sides, with several 100,000 lives lost. In order to ensure the security of his northern border, he relocated some 700,000 colonists to live in the area now rendered safe through the vanquishing of the Xiongnu. This both expanded the Han domains and eliminated a dire threat to his empire. It also showed that the difference between the Confucian and legalism aside, Wu was willing to deploy the methods of the ferocious antecedent Qin Shi Huang when it served his purposes. To change to a cavalry force that had led to the Han victory was no simple matter of just simply flipping a switch. It required a different kind of horse, one not native to the Han Empire. The horses of the Chinese military, the ones pulling the chariots into battle, were small, pony-like animals. They couldn't support the weight of a fully armor-clad warrior. If Wu's forces were going to switch to cavalry, they had needed to upgrade their mounts, but how had they done it? Early in his reign, rumors had begun to drift into the Han court of a far-off people called the Fergana that bred, quote, heavenly horses, close quote. Large, strong breeds of mythic size, speed, and strength. The breeders of these horses lived far away, far to the northwest, across the impassable Taklamakan Desert and over the formidable Tian Shan Mountains. Some peaks in this range soared past 24,000 feet. All the way back in 138 BCE, Wu had dispatched an ambassador named Zhang Xian to gather 100 companions, lead an expedition to these mysterious peoples, and bring back some heavenly horses. Zhang Xian thus undertook one of the truly epic adventures of exploration in history. His group traveled all the way to the northwestern end of the Great Wall and then into the Taklamakan Desert. To give you a sense of what they were up against, the name for this desert roughly translates as, go into this place and you won't come out alive. He next had to make his way over the Tian Shan Mountains, all while avoiding the roving Zhang Yu. Twice he was captured. At one point, he was made prisoner for 10 years. After 13 years of roaming, Zhang Qian made it to Wu's court, long after he and his companions had been given up for dead. Of the original 100 that had accompanied the ambassador on his journey, only one other guy had survived. But they brought with them incredible tales of adventure, intrigue, and most importantly, confirmed the existence of the heavenly horses. Zhang Xian also shared what he learned of other great empires. China had been quite disconnected from all the other great civilizations of the ancient world, as it was bound on all sides by mountains, deserts, and roving nomad stepped warriors. But Zhang Xian told Wu of great empires and places called Persia and India, giving Wu the first indication that his kingdom might profit from commerce with others. Wu immediately dispatched another expedition to buy some of the heavenly horses. When the Fergana people refused, Wu dispatched an army of 60,000 to march the 1,500 grueling miles and set with them orders to bring back the coveted horses. In this task, his troops were successful, capturing a breeding herd and bringing them back over the mountains, through the desert, along the Great Wall, away from the Zhang Yu raiders, and all the way to Wu's court. With their new mounts, Wu's army switched to cavalry, rode north, and eliminated the long-festering Zhang Yu threat. This series of expeditions did more than give Wu the tool he needed to crush the Zhang Yu. With the new bigger horses, Wu could extend travel and trade further and safer than ever before. It was essentially a massive upgrade in transportation. By accompanying merchants with state-sponsored security, traders could go further and further, exchanging Chinese luxury goods for other valuable commodities, such as jade. For the first time in China's long history, Wu began to consider connecting his country with the community of great nations and empires. With the knowledge of the riches outside his borders and his quest to assert Han power, Wu established a series of military outposts along the route to far-off rich lands of Fergana, and to a place we spent a lot of time with when we were with the Persians and the Macedonians, Bactria. This formalized a trade network which sent goods like silk, jade jewelry, porcelain, and spices out of China and returned with glassware, textiles, furs, and of course, horses. Connecting to this trade network was not an accident. It was not the result of far-ranging merchants slowly venturing further and further afield in search of profitable trade. Rather, engagement in this international mercantile project was a deliberate edict by Wu. In earlier episodes, we talked about the major east-west axis that the Persian Empire had formed and the connection of India into the Hellenized world through the campaigns of Alexander and Chandragupta. China's entrance into this world was the final linchpin in the creation of what we now know as the Silk Road, or as some scholars prefer to call it these days, the Silk Route. It was through the vision of Wu that China connected to and traded with the outside world, perhaps the first time in its already long history that China set its vision beyond its immediate borders and deliberately engaged with the outside world. This trade network was not one road connecting two distant points of the compass. Rather, it was a network of routes that crisscrossed all over Eurasia. This is why many scholars, who just can't seem to have even a little bit of fun, have insisted on changing the name from the Silk Road to the Silk Route. It's not a schooner, it's a sailboat. The various kingdoms through which this network sprawled deployed state resources to make sure the traders were protected from bandits and robbers. The profits from this international trade were enormous. Of course, like many important historical developments, the dates that this trade network were formalized vary wildly. But most agree that by 112 BCE, the Silk Road, and I'm still going to call it that, was up and running, and boy did the profits pour in. The Silk Road was traveled not only by merchants, but also diplomats, adventurers, soldiers, teachers, and missionaries. It was more than physical goods that moved around its different routes. Ideas moved from place to place, too. The trade facilitated cultural exchanges that brought people into contact with different ideas, religions, technologies, philosophies, styles of government, art, architecture, you name it. It was due to the Silk Road that Buddhism began making inroads into China, and why, to this day, it is one of the main faiths in China with nearly 250 million followers. The Silk Road, in other words, enabled cultural, not just commercial integration. But above all, the most important good traded on the Silk Road was, well, silk. The world had a positive mania for the intricately woven and delicate fabric. It became a status symbol all over the world, in Rome, in Egypt, in Persia, in India. The world's markets could never get enough, and rich people would pay almost any price. So profitable was the silk trade that Wu took great pains to make sure that the processes of making and weaving silk fabric remained a carefully guarded state secret. Divulgence of any of this secret knowledge could be punishable by death, and any foreigner caught trying to smuggle out any part of the silk production process could face the same fate. It's hard to overstate how profitable the silk trade was, and the lengths to which the Persian, Roman, Greek, and Egyptian elites were willing to go, the exorbitant costs they were willing to pay to get their hands on this elite status symbol. In 112 or 111 BCE, the southern Yue kingdoms again started acting up. Nanyue was ruled by a Han puppet king, and the country had been a protectorate of the Han. Rankling at the domineering Han, and itching to bring Nanyue back to independence, a native Nanyue prime minister assassinated the Han puppet king and seized power for himself. Unwilling to allow for such a challenge to Han hegemony, Wu ordered an army of 100,000 to march south and suppress this bid for independence. This force utterly obliterated the Nanyue forces. The prime minister and the puppet king he had installed were captured and hacked to pieces. Nominal self-rule was over. Wu incorporated this kingdom into his empire, and the Han Empire grew a bit bigger. Over in Minyue, the independent-minded locals were horrified by the brutality of Wu's suppression. They looked around and figured that nothing stood between their kingdom and the Han army. The Minyue calculated that after they finished wrapping up operations in Nanyue, the Han would invade Minyue territory and stamp out any last vestiges of independence. Not waiting for Wu to come calling, they preemptively launched an invasion of Han territory. But this action was controversial, and the more level-headed members of the royal court understood that this invasion would likely yield catastrophic results for Minyue. These advisors hatched a conspiracy, murdered the king, sent his corpse to Wu's forces, and fully submitted to Han rule. It might have been savvy politics, but Wu's fury was not so easily abated. He decided to ensure that Minyue could never become a seat of rebellion again. He forced the mass deportation of its people into fertile river valleys of central China and left the area largely depopulated. Cowed by these actions, in short order, all the lesser kingdoms offered their supplication, and Wu successfully expanded the empire's borders to the south, including adding to the fold the profitable Nanyue trading ports along the coast. The luxury good from these regions, including peacock feathers, pearls, and elephant tusks, unleashed a mania in the Han nobility, sparking a surge in interregional commerce. Access to the vital trading ports, and bolstered by a deeper understanding of the world beyond China, gave Wu's merchant fleets new markets, and Chinese vessels undertook enormously profitable trading expeditions. China's economy boomed, and the territories of the Yue were thoroughly assimilated into Chinese culture. Shortly after these campaigns, a ruler in the kingdom of Gojoseon, modern-day Korea, grew tired of Han meddling and had a Han official executed. It's hard to tell if Wu was genuinely furious or if he just used this incident as a pretext, but either way, he took his battle-tested army northeast, invaded, and conquered the northern half of the Korean peninsula. Wu pushed the borders even further, and he just kept going. His armies kept pushing further and further afield. They conquered south, they conquered west, they conquered northwest. The borders just kept expanding. In fact, under Wu, the Han Empire reached its greatest extent. He was considered the greatest warrior of his long, long dynasty and one of the most successful in all of Chinese history. It's also worth noting that despite the stark differences in how they were portrayed, there are some serious parallels to the agendas and methods of Wu and Qin Shi Huang. Wu had created a militaristic, economic, and intellectual dynamo. Unfortunately, pushing the Han Empire to such great heights had come at tremendous cost. His building projects, the military, the overseas adventures, all of these had drained state resources. Like Qin Shi Huang, he had begun construction on his own mausoleum just after ascending to the throne. The work on this project would go on for more than 5 decades and consume nearly 1/3 of the imperial revenues. At the same time, as he prepared for death, Wu tried to extend his life. He toured his vast empire seeking magicians and shamans with insights into immortality. He lavished gifts on those he found worthy. The arrival of the imperial entourage was a dreaded sight for local leaders. Traveling with huge numbers of retainers and expected to be feted in style and extravagance, Wu's imperial progresses depleted the resources of the locals wherever he went. Some local officials opted for suicide rather than face the prospect of being unable to meet the exorbitant needs of the emperor and his court. The magical mystery tour came and took them away. All these vanity projects strained the people to the breaking point. Around 100 BCE, peasant revolts began flaring up across China. Wu was more annoyed than worried. This was a problem he just didn't want to deal with. He issued orders that his provincial leaders needed to crush rebellions. Should they fail to do so, they would in turn be executed. Wu figured that this would light a fire under his commanders and ensure that any threats to his rule would be eliminated quickly and ruthlessly. But rather than create motivation for the ruthless suppression of peasant revolts, Wu's edicts created an incentive for his commanders to simply hide the news of revolts from him and his advisors. As a result, serious issues rose throughout the empire, and Wu was ignorant of them. The rebellions seemed to burn themselves out, but his power and prestige had been undermined, and all without his awareness. With callous indifference to the suffering of his peasants, Wu enjoyed his court life. In particular, he was personally enthralled with the arts. He encouraged literacy, music, and intellectual life at his court. For example, the imperial courts had people serving in various capacities to support the emperor and the dynasty. One of these was the court historian. Traditionally, this historian served to emphasize the glory of the emperor, embellishing the record with myths, omens, and fabrications to shine the brightest light possible. But under Wu, this office took a serious turn towards legitimacy, starting with the court historian Sima Tan, and then continued by his son and successor Sima Xian. The vision they brought to the role was less to mythologize the emperor and ruling house and more about recording and preserving fact-based history. They set the ambitious project of documenting and ensuring the continual understanding of the past of all of China. The work, largely completed by Sima Xian, is known as the Records of the Grand Historian. It was monumental in scale, going into great detail about various regions, peoples, cultures, events, conflicts, etc. It was the very first attempt that we know of to organize Chinese history into a single treatment. It also speaks to the intellectual atmosphere at the Han court. Rather than prescribe a strict regime of propaganda, Wu allowed for a more sincere attempt at historical accuracy. The Records of the Grand Historian was duly entered into the imperial archives. For his part, Sima Xian is considered the father of Chinese history and ranks among the all-time greats for the professionalization and intellectual rigor that he brought to the work. The arts likewise thrived under Wu's rule. He was particularly fond of poetry and acted as a patron to several poets. He even wrote his own poetry, and some of the works attributed to him are well thought of for their composition and elegance. Music, too, was a great passion for the emperor. As with the poets, he patronized court musicians to compose new songs and performances. He delighted in listening to their work, and his court was often gathered to hear the latest compositions. He formalized this love of music by founding the Music Bureau, an imperial department tasked with gathering music from all corners of the empire and bringing the songs back to the palace, where they would be rehearsed, then played by court musicians. This department also saw to the composition of ceremonial music to accompany and enrich state rituals. And Wu loved state rituals, in part to further the ancestor worship central to his belief system, and in part to reinforce his own rule as the head of state. Wu invented and enacted countless rituals for any number of occasions. The scientific and intellectual tone at court led to a number of staggering scientific and engineering breakthroughs. Among these was the invention of paper, which was transformative to record keeping and communications. Another remarkable breakthrough was the construction of the world's first suspension bridge. This allowed for greater improvements in infrastructure, commerce, and economic efficiency. Imagine the joy of a farmer who could load up their produce and cross right over a river gorge, rather than take a long way around or find a ford at a river, transverse down and then back out of a chasm. More produce got to market faster, feeding more people, making agriculture more productive and profitable, and eliminating waste. Now, speaking of those farmers, their work and that of countless other trades got another lift with yet another great invention, the wheelbarrow, which made carting heavy loads much easier and ergonomically efficient. At this point, you might be thinking, this guy sounds pretty great, or at least interesting. But to consider Wu completely, we need to look past his policies and to his personal conduct. For while he advocated Confucianism and made it a state policy, in his own life he was firmly legalist in his approach. That is to say, he never shied away from harsh punishments, executions, and imprisonments for all of those that ran afoul of him. One example. The star of Wu's music bureau was a young eunuch named Li Yanyan. Tall, handsome, and supremely talented, Li Yanyan held the emperor in thrall with his performances. So much so that he and Wu became lovers. Li Yanyan was a gifted composer as well as performer, and he wrote elegant song poems to accompany the countless court rituals being invented by the emperor. Just when he seemed to be at his peak in the favor of the emperor, Li Yanyan's younger brother was caught having an affair with a palace lady. Both brothers were summarily executed, and for good measure, Wu had their entire family seized and put to death as well. Another, more sweeping example of Wu's wrath came in 122 BCE, when the emperor's uncle, Liu An, and his brother, Liu Si, hatched a conspiracy to overthrow Wu. At the outset of the emperor's rule, Liu An had begun in Wu's good graces. Liu An was a trusted member of the emperor's inner circle, and Wu treated him with a great respect. But over time, Liu An's own ambitions got the better of him. Liu An had long wished to be emperor himself. Given his blood ties to the regime, he was the grandson of the Han dynasty's founder, Liu Bang. Liu An, at first, encouraged in these ambitions when Wu had failed to produce an heir. He hoped that if Wu couldn't have children, then he might be able to claim the throne for himself. Rumors of Wu's infertility were put to rest when Wu began having children. Liu An then began plotting a more direct overthrow of the emperor. The plot was revealed to Wu, and he flew into a rage. He immediately had Liu An and Liu Si executed. Then he vented his fury on their supporters, whom he tracked down methodically and had killed. And then the killing just kept going. Anyone suspected of even the most tenuous ties to the brothers was rounded up and summarily dispatched. Several thousand people died in the bloodletting, and all because of a harebrained coup from a couple of petty, jealous brothers. Incidentally, and not at all germane to this story, but interesting enough that it warrants the brief non sequitur, Liu An is still with us today, as he is credited with being the inventor of tofu. Wu's wrath could extend to even his immediate family. As so happens in powerful dynastic families, the question of succession is always of great importance. This issue gets more confusing when a ruler has multiple wives and concubines, and as a result, numerous sons as candidates for succession. Ambitious retainers formed alliances with the powerful families of the wives and concubines. Wu's palaces were full of plots and suspicions and rivalries and overt hatred between the participants. These rivalries reached their apex when two great families of the court fell into a deep and vicious feud. The empress and her son, the crown prince Zhu, were from the Wei family. Also powerful at court, and like the Wei, also tied by blood to the emperor, was the Li family. The two families schemed against one another, both aiming to place their preferred candidate on the throne and thus ensure that dynastic succession would flow through their bloodlines. In 91 BCE, one of the key members of the Li family, Zhang Chong, made a move against the crown prince, Wu's son, Prince Zhu. Zhang Chong accused the crown prince of using witchcraft to subvert the health of the emperor. Witchcraft was a sore spot for Wu. Like many ego-driven rulers, he had become obsessed with immortality. I guess when you have unfettered power, the thought of losing it in death is a lot to bear. Wu had begun to retain the services of diviners and magicians to help him in his quest for eternal life. At the same time, he outlawed such practices in his empire, and punishments for those that defied the royal decree were harsh. In prior years, Wu had ordered literal witch hunts, seeking to eradicate the practice and liquidating members of his inner circle who had been accused. Yet he continued to participate in mystery rites and employed diviners for himself. One set of standards for the people, a different set for the ruler. Zhang Chang's accusation of the crown prince, the intended heir to the throne, of witchcraft, was a blow directly aimed to hit one of the emperor's deep paranoias. The charge was utterly absurd, but Wu ordered Zhang Chang to investigate. He and his conspirators dug up pits all over the palace, looking for the cursed buried puppets that would indicate that Wu was the target of the insidious practices. Much like a bad cop movie with a bad cop planting evidence in a crime drama, Zhang Chang found evidence everywhere. The puppets were covered with curses and incantations, all calling for ill health and death of the emperor. Zhang Chang smugly showed Wu. The emperor's paranoia deepened. Prince Zhu was infuriated. He knew that his father was likely to believe this trumped-up evidence and saw no choice but to arm and defend himself. He gathered up forces of his own and launched a military coup aimed not at his father but at Zhang Chang. Whether intentionally or not, the prince's rash action gave all his detractors they needed in order to spin tales of mutiny. They hysterically claimed that the prince was trying to overthrow the emperor. Wu, for his part, could not allow a rebellion of any kind, and he reluctantly ordered his army to confront the forces of his son. For 5 days, the opposing forces of the emperor and his son battled it out in the streets of the capital, Chang'an. The bloodshed was awful. Thousands of troops died in the fighting. Eventually, Wu's superior forces crushed those of his son, and Prince Zhu fled the countryside with his mother and his own 2 sons. They were taken in by a kindly peasant couple who took pity on them. Wu was hesitant to fully punish his son and hoped for a reconciliation. The enemies of the prince at court were not going to let the opportunity to stake their claim to succession pass. Their troops tracked down the royal family in the countryside and surrounded the house where the prince had been hiding. To avoid further bloodshed, Prince Zhu hung himself. His mother likewise committed suicide. The soldiers stormed the house, killed Zhu's son, and, for good measure, butchered the family that had housed them. They triumphantly brought the corpse back to Wu, who, while deeply grieved at the death of his son, nevertheless fulfilled the reward due to those that had killed an enemy of the state. But he would have his revenge. Methodically, he exterminated all of Zhang Chang's family. First, close relatives, then extended family. One after one, he dispatched the relatives of the man who had engineered his son's downfall, and in the process sowed the seeds of destruction of his whole family. But he didn't stop there. Increasingly paranoid about witchcraft and people's attempts to use it to undermine his health, Wu had undertaken another witch hunt, tracking down and killing anyone suspected of dabbling in the dark arts. Ruthless people around the emperor fueled his paranoia, whispering accusations to ensure the deaths of rivals. Each person accused was as good as condemned, the emperor's paranoia fueling a prescription of staggering proportions. By the time all was said and done, the Li family was nearly exterminated. Hundreds of people died, many of whom were simply convenient pawns in a violent game of suspicion and recrimination. But Wu, for all this paranoia, was no fool. He slowly came to realize that the accusations of witchcraft, especially those against his son, were fabricated specifically to evoke his reaction. He lamented the loss of life and grieved for his dead son. He also surveyed the state of his kingdom. The people were miserable, heavily taxed and hungry, having to give over most of their produce to feed the army. Wu, perhaps shaken by his failure to live up to the Confucian ideal of benevolence and care for his subjects, was deeply affected. As such, he did something truly remarkable. He apologized. In what is called the Repenting Edict of Lun Tai, Wu asked for forgiveness for his policy mistakes and promised to reform China and himself. In the edict, he said, quote, "The most important task at the moment is to strictly prohibit officials at all levels from being harsh and cruel to the people and to stop them from increasing taxes without authorization," close quote. Wu's edict is astonishing. Chinese dynastic rule was nearly 2 millennia into its long run, and so far there does not seem to have been any ruler with either the inclination or the ability to acknowledge their own failures and to do so publicly for all of their subjects to see and hear. Consider that rulers owed their position to the mandate of heaven. If they were enthroned, then it was the will of the divine that they be so. Therefore, kings or emperors, their actions were necessarily divinely sanctified just by virtue of holding the throne in the first place. Only by losing their crown to an upstart could a monarch be proven to have been acting out of alignment with the mandate of heaven. But Wu both held on to his throne and repudiated his own actions. Dissatisfied with his own leadership, he vowed to change, even absent a raging rebellion bent on questioning his legitimacy. The repenting edict of Luntai is therefore a remarkable moment in government. For Wu, these were more than empty words. He followed up the edict by establishing a new minister, the Marquis of Enriching the People. This official was mandated with finding and fixing problems across the Han Empire. This led to many reforms such as lowering taxes, improving agricultural systems and irrigation, and shifting autonomy back to local regions. Perhaps most importantly, Wu gave up his ambitions for further military conquest. Understanding that the root of much disaffection against him was tied to needing to field and feed his massive armies, Wu shifted his attention to promoting peace. In this, we can hear echoes of Ahsoka, who likewise decided that the path of cruelty and violence only led to suffering, both for himself and for his people. Wu understood that failure to appoint a successor would guarantee a civil war. The powerful Li and Wei families would certainly unleash a torrent of bloodshed to fight for control of the Dragon Throne. But which family should rule? It was a difficult question to answer, as Wu had grown disillusioned with and paranoid about both of the haughty families. Just before he died, Wu named his 8-year-old son, Liu Fuling, as crown prince. The young prince was neither a Li or a Wei. Neither family would have a role in following administration. To ensure the prince was well advised and properly trained in the art of kingship, Wu ensured a proper regent would be by his son's side, appointing the general and statesman Huo Guang to the key position. Reflecting on his own life and remembering the meddlesome role his mother and grandmother had played in his own first few years on the throne, Wu had Liu Fuling's mother executed to prevent his successor from having to endure such malfeasance. In his rise to power, and through most of his reign, Wu had failed to live up to the Confucian ideals that he still promulgated as the official doctrine and policy of the state. In setting up the succession, Wu moved a little closer to the policy of merit-based rule and service, eschewing familial benefits for the good of the people. Just 2 days after appointing Liu Fuling as successor, Wu died at the age of 71. He had ruled for an eventful 54 years. He was interred in his own monumental mausoleum, which had been under construction for 5 decades. His own city of the dead was capped by a pyramid, 500,000 square feet at its base and 150 feet high. It was the largest Han tomb ever built, befitting the larger-than-life emperor who defined the dynasty. With Wu, in considering the question of his greatness, there is a bit of a paradox. On one hand, he pushed his country to lofty heights in numerous ways. In fact, some have called this rule China's golden age. But on the other hand, he could be despotic and cruel and arbitrary in his punishments. Any ruler, for better or worse, is judged by the legacy they leave behind. Regardless of his personal behavior, the integration of Confucianism into the Chinese state was transformative to the country. It was the guiding force behind Chinese governance for 2 millennia, a preposterously long time for any governance structure to endure. Dynasties rose and fell, to be sure, but the Confucian model instituted by Wu was a mainstay for millennia. Not only did this create great continuity, but it also provided an institutional framework for China to endure the turbulence that comes with the inevitable rises and falls of ruling families. It's also strange to give people credit for longevity. Should not dying for a while be something counted among someone's accomplishments? Maybe or maybe not. For a ruler of a powerful empire, longevity can be evidence of the ability to survive or avoid palace plots. Wu's 54 years on the throne were certainly worth noting. Not only did he rule for twice as long as the next longest reigning Han emperor, but it would be 1,800 years, nearly 2 millennia before another ruler would surpass the length of his reign. It wasn't just how long he lived, it's what he did with it. His rule was eventful. He inherited an empire with a tenuous grip on its territory and left it enlarged, strong, and centralized. Less a loose affiliation of semi-independent kingdoms and more of a true nation-state. His conquests doubled the size of Han territory, and with them, he pushed Chinese culture outward, influencing the regions that are modern-day Korea, Vietnam, even Japan. Reflecting on the campaigns above, many of them began with challenges outside his borders. In the case of the Yue kingdoms, Wu's intervention occurred after conflict with those kingdoms required, or at least justified, his involvement. Wu's campaigns might have pushed China to its largest extent to date and ensured the dynasty reached its apex during his rule, but he wasn't an obsessive conqueror in the model of Alexander, or at least he eschewed conquest for its own sake later in life and genuinely pursued a policy of peace at the end of his rule. The Civil Service Examination and Confucian Training Academy were critical innovations. Various leaders had pursued meritocratic administrations before, but Wu took this a step further by creating a way of evaluating individuals fit for office and then giving them the tools they needed to develop into competent members of the imperial bureaucracy. This stocked the government with people not only of talent, but of experience and knowledge. The reforms of Wu helped stabilize his dynasty and provided the foundation for China's system of government for the next 2,000 years until the end of the dynastic period in 1912. Once his conquests had concluded, Wu had stabilized the borders, encouraged peace and cultural development in the arts and sciences. Technological developments reached dizzying heights. The brilliant minds of Chinese industry developed many of the commonplace items we take for granted today, such as the wheelbarrow, the compass, the adjustable wrench, the seismograph, and paper, to name only a few. I mean, the seismograph? Yes, the Chinese developed a system to detect seismic activity. Even after Wu died, the momentum established in science and engineering continued to produce paradigmatic technologies, including the moldboard plow, the stirrup, the ship's rudder, even deep drilling, reaching a depth of 4,800 feet. The technological advances during Wu's and subsequent Han reign is utterly and completely staggering. This time period ranks among the greatest in human history for engineering and technology and is one of the prime reasons Han China is considered by many to be its golden age. The world got a whole lot smaller thanks to the Silk Road, and Wu deserves a lot of credit for tilting China away from its long-standing isolationism and connecting the empire to the world at large. Granted, much of China's long-standing isolation was due more to roving nomads, mountains, and deserts hemming in the country, but Wu worked to get past these obstacles in a proactive and deliberate manner. He brought China to the world and the world to China, to all people's mutual benefit. And in the Han period, this meant a lot more people. Estimates vary, of course, but the population of China tripled from 20 to 60 million under his dynasty. Its economy likewise surged. Under the Han in general, and Wu specifically, China's economic productivity surged, accounting for approximately 25% of global GDP. Incidentally, India, which likewise benefited from the surge in international trade brought about by the Silk Road, accounted for roughly 30% of GDP. The two regions therefore totaled more than half of the cumulative economic output of the entire globe. When some people get all caught up in hand-wringing about China's economic rise, you can laugh a little, because you can remind them that this is nothing new. China's surge in global share of GDP is a return to millennia-old historic norms. The only true aberration was the brief blip, historically speaking, of China's economic decline. Things are now as they've always been. But, as mentioned, the Silk Road did more than foster commerce. It also put people and ideas in contact with one another in a way that had never happened before, diffusing cultural values, religions, and artistic and intellectual traditions across the East-West Eurasian axis. The Age of Wu was a time of electric economic and intellectual exchange. Now, when it comes to his name, as in so many other ways, things get a bit tricky. Wu is considered by many to be one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, but he's only called Wu the Great here and there. It is by no means a universal moniker in the way that Alexander and the Great go together in the collective consciousness. Personally, I think this is a bit irrelevant. We're here to assess people that history has called the Great, and people definitely call Wu great, even if not everyone likes to say Wu the Great. We will encounter this dilemma a bit later when we get to know Genghis Khan. Much of Wu's life is subject to debate and interpretation. On one hand, he can be seen as the founder of his country, a true cultural father who elevated his people to great heights. On the other hand, he can be portrayed as a ruthless tyrant who crushed lesser kingdoms, wiping out their own cultures. Gripped with paranoia and an obsession with his own immortality, he unleashed repeated waves of purges and bloodletting. Is one or the other the true Wu of the Han? Or did his repenting edict absolve him of his sins? How much credit does someone get for being contrite and seeking to make amends? As with every subject in this series, you will have to decide for yourself, but what cannot be argued is the impact he had. Wu of the Han transformed China and deserves his place as one of the most consequential figures in that country's long and glorious history. That much is not up for debate. It's why, no matter what we think of him, he is known and remembered as Wu the Great. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. In the next episode, we are heading back to Asia Minor to meet the Anatolian king whose life is full of adventure and intrigue, a paranoia of poison, and an abject hatred of the ascendant Romans. We're going to the ancient kingdom of Pontus to meet Mithridates VI, the Poison King himself. It's going to be a wild ride, and I can't wait to see you there.